Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to learn about compound complex sentences, and then we'll analyze types of sentences you will come across in actual TOEFL passages. Okay, so far we've seen three different types of sentences that use independent and dependent clauses. And we also learned about three types of dependent clauses. We also looked at a very common structure in academic English, a noun phrase. And in the previous lesson, we looked at how participle phrases and clauses are used. The final sentence we're going to look at is a compound complex sentence. This type of sentence is made up of at least two independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. So let's first take a look at an example compound complex sentence. The teacher made efforts to include the student who had been unable to work with other students for months, but the student continued to cause trouble in the class. Okay, so if we look at this sentence, first we have an independent clause. The teacher made efforts to include the student. And again, we see the noun phrase efforts to include the student, which functions as the object of the verb. And in this noun phrase, there is the head noun efforts and post-modifying words to infinitive phrase to include the student. Then we have a relative clause, the dependent clause, and we see a coordinating conjunction but. And then we see the second independent clause. So altogether, this sentence has two independent clauses and one dependent clause. So it's a compound complex sentence. Now, the key thing to note with long compound complex sentences is that while there is no specific rules on how many clauses a sentence can have, it's generally unusual to see a sentence with like 4 independent clauses and 3 dependent clauses. That's just way too much information in a single sentence. However, it's common to see sentences with 2 or 3 independent clauses with 2 or 3 dependent clauses in a single sentence. Let's take a look at another example compound complex sentence. What constitutes a breach of agreement is clearly stipulated in the contract, but the dispute ended up in the courts, and the legal battle, which cost both parties millions, lasted over 5 years. So in this sentence, there are 2 dependent clauses, the noun clause in the first independent clause, which acts as the sentence subject, and the non-defining relative clause in the third independent clause. And in this sentence, there are 3 independent clauses joined by the coordinating conjunctions but and. So this sentence is a compound complex sentence, and it has 3 independent clauses and 2 dependent clauses. And it's a very clear and flowing sentence. So to wrap up on compound complex sentences, they are sentences made up of at least 2 independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clause. And while not every sentence is long and complex as these in TOEFL, seeing such long sentences in TOEFL passages is quite common. Okay, so let's now take a look at some example sentences which can be seen in TOEFL passages. And as we go through the sentences, we will dissect the sentences and look at different types of clauses and phrases in each sentence. During the infancy of cinema, the importance of music was understood, but the relationship between music and the screen action was not fully appreciated. Now, this sentence is just a compound sentence. It begins with a prepositional phrase, which is adverbial. It tells us when this sentence is about. Then we have the first independent clause, and it's joined to the second independent clause with the conjunction but. And the second independent clause has a long noun phrase, which functions as the subject of the clause. So overall, this is a long sentence in terms of number of words used, but technically it's just 2 independent clauses joined by the conjunction but. So it's actually not that complex. Let's take a look at another sentence. Xerophytes, which include cactuses, an adaptation from the rose family, are effective desert plants because they have spines instead of leaves. This sentence is a complex sentence, and it contains 1 independent clause and 2 dependent clauses. First, the independent clause is xerophytes are effective desert plants, and we have a relative clause which gives more information about the noun xerophytes. Then we have a group of words that define the noun cactuses, and this is called an appositive phrase. An appositive phrase is a phrase which helps to describe a noun, and it's usually separated from the noun using commas. And then we have the second dependent clause, an adverbial clause, because they have spine instead of leaves, and it uses the subordinating conjunction because. And this kind of sentence can seem tricky to understand as you have two different elements between the subject and the verb in the independent clause. And obviously there are multiple elements within the sentence as well. However, all in all, there are one independent clause and two dependent clauses. Okay, so let's take a look at one more example sentence. At one time, cellular slime molds were regarded as organisms of ambiguous taxonomic status. But more recent analysis of DNA sequences has shown that slime molds should be regarded as inhabiting their own separate kingdom. Okay, so this is now a much longer sentence, and sentences like this can be difficult to understand as there's so much information to take in. So this is where knowing how to break down sentences becomes really useful. Okay, so if we start reading, we can get to this point where we see a coordinating conjunction, but. So this first part is an independent clause, and it begins with the prepositional phrase at one time, and then after that it says cellular slime molds were regarded. And then we have another preposition as, and after that we have a long noun phrase that functions as the object of the preposition as. After the first independent clause, we have the coordinating conjunction but. So right after, we have another independent clause, and it begins with a long noun phrase. And then we have the verb phrase, and the object is a noun clause which begins with that. And at the end, there is a prepositional phrase as inhabiting their own separate kingdom. So this sentence has two independent clauses and one dependent clause. So it's a compound complex sentence. And although this sentence only has 3 clauses, because it uses long noun phrases, it is packed with information, which makes it tricky to understand the sentence as a whole. So as you can see, TOEFL sentences don't always have many different clauses, but they include many long noun phrases and multiple prepositional phrases to add more information in the sentence. Okay, so to wrap up this lesson, as demonstrated with sentences from TOEFL reading passages, when you read long sentences, it is helpful to break up the sentence and focus on smaller chunks of language. And this will help you to comprehend the sentence, which will ultimately help you to answer the questions better in the reading and the listening section. Additionally, you need to demonstrate an ability to use both simple and complex sentence types. So you need to be able to formulate your own compound complex sentences in your speaking and writing responses. With that in mind, do make sure to do the quiz that follows and make use of the worksheet to practice forming compound complex sentences. That's it for this lecture on compound complex sentences.